Inside a vault at Yale University, a name someone scraped off a page 400 years ago was waiting to resurface and undo a century of failure. The Voynich Manuscript is not the untouched, unsolvable mystery everyone assumes it is. Someone got close enough to break it that their name had to be erased from the page. For over 100 years, publishers and universities have crowned a new solver every few years, then quietly buried that same solver days later, protecting their own credibility instead of the truth. The man who made this book famous, Wilfrid Voynich, spent his fortune and the rest of his life trying to prove it hid a secret worth that obsession. He died in 1930 without ever knowing he was right. Now, inside Yale's Bayneka Library, a modern scan of that same erased page, Folio 1 Recto, has finally confirmed what he never lived to see. Somebody centuries before him had already tried to break this code, and somebody made sure the world would never know how close they got. Here's what the world thinks it knows. Somewhere around the year 1400, in an unknown workshop in an unknown country, someone sat down and filled a book with a language that has never been matched to anything on Earth. Not Latin, not Hebrew, not Arabic, not any dead script ever cataloged. The book survives, whole enough to hold in your hands, and it is stuffed with drawings of plants that do not exist, star charts that follow no known system, and pages of naked women, bathing in green pools, connected by strange tubes, like something out of a fever dream, drawn with medieval precision. Deeper in, the pages shift again, rows of isolated roots and jars that look pharmaceutical, dense blocks of text with no pictures at all, and, folded into the middle of the book, a 6-panel fold-out covered in 9 linked circles, dotted with tiny castles and what several researchers believe might be a volcano. Nobody has ever agreed on what that fold-out shows. A map, a star chart, a diagram of the heavens. It just sits there unexplained, one mystery folded inside a bigger one. The book sits today behind glass at Yale, cataloged coldly as manuscript number 408, and it is one of the most viewed documents on Yale's own digital archive. Historians call it the world's most mysterious book. Cryptographers call it the one that beat everyone. For over 100 years, that reputation has been earned the hard way by failure, because everyone has tried. A First World War era codebreaker claimed he'd cracked it and named a medieval friar as the author. Decades later, the legendary American cryptanalyst William Friedman, the same man who helped break Japan's purple cipher during the Second World War, assembled a team of professional code breakers specifically to attack this manuscript. They failed completely. Friedman spent years on it, and his final conclusion, reportedly left behind as a coded anagram for others to work out after his death, was that the book wasn't a cipher at all. It was an attempt to build an entirely artificial, invented language from scratch. Even America's best-trained cryptographic minds couldn't get further than a guess. In the past 10 years alone, at least 4 separate researchers have announced publicly that they had finally solved the Voynich Manuscript. Every single one of those announcements collapsed, not slowly, fast, within days, in some cases within hours. And that pattern, solve, headline, collapse, is where the real story starts, because it means something has been quietly training the public to stop looking too closely. But somebody looked closely anyway. And in 2024, a specialist in medieval manuscripts pulled a detail out of an old imaging scan that had been sitting in Yale's own archive for a decade, mostly ignored. It wasn't a translation, it was something stranger. Proof that a real person, centuries ago, got close enough to this book that his name had to be removed from the page. That's the crack, not a theory, not a guess. A physical erasure sitting on Folio 1 that nobody outside a small circle of manuscript specialists had ever paid attention to. Somebody in the past tried to solve this thing, and somebody, maybe the same person, maybe someone after them, decided that attempt needed to disappear. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the vellum's creation, to the moment the modern world found this book at all, and to the one man who staked his entire reputation on convincing everyone it was worth caring about. His name was Wilfrid Voynich, and by the time he bought this manuscript, he had already survived a life most people wouldn't believe if you put it in a film. Born in the 1860s in the Russian Empire, in what is now Lithuania, he joined an underground revolutionary movement as a young man, was arrested by the Tsarist police in Warsaw, and was sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, exiled to a settlement near Irkutsk. He escaped. He made his way across Europe and landed in London, where he reinvented himself completely. From prisoner to antiquarian book dealer, one of the most respected in the city. He married Ethel Boole, daughter of the mathematician George Boole, and built a career finding and selling rare manuscripts to collectors who trusted his eye completely. In 1912, that eye landed on something unusual. Voynich was examining a collection of old books at the Villa Mondragone, a property near Rome connected to the Jesuit order, when he found a manuscript unlike anything he had handled before. Strange script, strange illustrations. No title, no author. He bought it, brought it back, and immediately began promoting it as something extraordinary. What he called the Roger Bacon cipher manuscript, naming it after a 13th century English friar famous for his early interest in optics and experimental science. If Roger Bacon had written this book in a hidden code, Voynich argued, it might contain some of the earliest scientific secrets in European history. It was a sales pitch built for headlines, and it worked. Voynich spent the rest of his life trying to prove it, and trying to sell the manuscript for a fortune. He never did either. He died in 1930, and the book he made famous was still, completely, unread. After his death, the manuscript passed to his widow, then to his secretary, and eventually to a dealer named Hans Kraus, who tried and failed to find a buyer willing to pay what he thought the book was worth. In 1969, unable to sell it, Kraus donated the manuscript to Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it has remained ever since, cataloged under its clinical name, Manuscript 408, stripped of Voynich's dramatic branding, but never able to shake his legend completely. Because the Roger Bacon story had already done its job. It had made the book famous. And that fame is exactly what makes what happened next so uncomfortable. Before Voynich, the manuscript had a longer, quieter history, one that only becomes visible if you dig through 17th century letters written in Latin between men who were genuinely afraid of what they didn't understand. The earliest solid evidence of ownership isn't a signature from some famous king. It's a name scrawled at the bottom of the first page, written by a man named Jakub Horczycki, sometimes recorded as Sinopius or Jacobus de Tepanek. He wasn't royalty. He rose from almost nothing. Accounts describe him starting as a kitchen servant at a castle in Bohemia and worked his way up to become an imperial pharmacist in Prague, eventually ennobled by Emperor Rudolf II in 1608. His signature on the manuscript, written after that ennoblement, is the earliest hard proof of where this book actually was in the early 1600s, not floating through Bacon's century, but sitting in the hands of a self-made court chemist in Prague, a city obsessed at the time with alchemy, cryptography, and Rudolph's personal appetite for the occult. There's a rumor attached to this period, repeated in almost every retelling of the Voynich story, that Rudolph II himself bought the manuscript for an enormous sum, 600 gold ducats, believing it held ancient secrets. It comes from a single second-hand letter, written decades after the fact, with no receipt, no inventory record, nothing to confirm it actually happened. Possible, unconfirmed. Repeated anyway, because it's exactly the kind of detail that makes an already strange book feel even stranger. From Horczycki, the trail runs to a Prague alchemist named Georg Beresch, who apparently spent years obsessing over the manuscript's meaning without getting anywhere, and then to a physician and university rector named Johannes Marcus Marci. In 1665 or 1666, Marci packaged the manuscript up and sent it to Rome to one of the most famous scholars in Europe, the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, a man who claimed, wrongly as it turned out, to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. Marci's letter to Kircher survives. In it, he essentially begs Kircher to try his hand at solving the book, admitting that previous owners had already spent enormous effort on it and failed completely. And then the manuscript vanishes. Not physically, it almost certainly stayed inside Jesuit collections in Rome, but from the written historical record. For roughly 250 years, there is no confirmed documentation of anyone opening this book, studying it, or even mentioning it existed. 2.5 centuries of silence, broken only when Wilfrid Voynich walked into that Roman villa in 1912 and pulled it back into the light. That's not necessarily suspicious on its own. Libraries lose track of things constantly, especially through the chaos of the Napoleonic era, when many Jesuit properties were seized and their collections scattered. But it means that whatever this manuscript actually is, it spent the majority of its known existence completely unexamined, sitting quietly inside an institution that had every reason not to advertise it. Here's where the suspicion starts to compound. The physical book itself isn't in its original order. Modern researchers, cataloging the numbering on each folded sheet, discovered gaps, evidence that pages are missing, and worse, evidence that the surviving pages have been rebound out of sequence at some point in their history. Researchers estimate close to 30 pages have vanished entirely, with no record of when or into whose hands. Whoever put this book back together after Voynich acquired, it wasn't necessarily seeing the manuscript the way its original author intended. And in 1976, a codebreaker who had worked for the National Security Agency, Prescott Courier, noticed something else strange buried in the statistics of the handwriting itself. The manuscript doesn't read like it was written by one consistent hand producing one consistent language. Courier wasn't reading the text for meaning. He was measuring it, tracking which letter combinations clustered together on which pages. What he found were two distinct statistical patterns running through the manuscript, which researchers now simply call language A and language B, different enough in their letter frequencies that they may represent two different scribes, two different dialects of whatever the script represents, or possibly two different phases of composition entirely. Decades later, in 2020, a specialist using digital paleography, essentially computer-assisted handwriting analysis, pushed that number even further, arguing the manuscript shows signs of 5 different scribes contributing to the same book. Not one obsessive genius working alone in candlelight, a team. Which raises an uncomfortable question nobody's fully answered. If this was some elaborate private hoax, why would it need 5 different people to pull off? For decades, the leading theory about who created this book pointed straight at Roger Bacon. The medieval friar Voynich used to sell the manuscript in the first place. It was a tempting theory because Bacon was a genuine outlier for his era, a 13th century scholar who wrote seriously about lenses, optics, and early experimental method centuries before science looked anything like science. If a manuscript this strange had to come from somewhere, a mind that far ahead of its time felt like the obvious answer. In 1921, a University of Pennsylvania philosopher named William Newbold announced he had cracked the code and confirmed it, claiming Bacon had hidden microscope and telescope-level discoveries inside the text using a secret shorthand, visible only under magnification. It was sensational. It made international news. And it was completely wrong. A decade later, in 1931, a University of Chicago scholar published a devastating rebuttal, demonstrating that what Newbold had identified as secret microscopic characters were simply cracks in dried ink, natural damage mistaken for a code. The Roger Bacon theory never fully recovered, but by then it had already done what it needed to do. It had made the manuscript famous, and it had planted a name in the public imagination that would take a hard piece of physical science to finally kill. That science arrived in 2009, and it changed everything about how researchers had to think about this book. A team at the University of Arizona, led by physicist Greg Hodgins, carried out radiocarbon dating on 4 separate vellum samples taken from different sections of the manuscript using accelerator mass spectrometry, a technique that measures the decay of radioactive carbon trapped inside organic material, in this case the calfskin the book was written on. The results were consistent across all 4 samples. The vellum dated to somewhere between 1404 and 1438, with 95% confidence. That's not a rough guess. That's about as close to a hard scientific fact as this manuscript has ever produced. And it should have ended the debate. It didn't. What it did was worse. In a way, it eliminated one mystery and opened a bigger one. Roger Bacon died in 1292. The vellum this manuscript is written on didn't exist yet when he was alive. The entire foundation of the theory that made this book famous was gone, disproven by physics, not opinion. But the radiocarbon date also did something researchers hadn't expected. Most experts, before the test, had estimated the manuscript was created decades later than it turned out to be, closer to the 1460s. The science pushed the date backward, not forward, meaning whoever created this thing was working with an invented, unreadable script a full generation earlier than anyone had assumed. The mystery didn't get smaller, it got older. Around the same time, a separate team at Macron Associates analyzed the ink and pigments used throughout the manuscript. What they found matched the period exactly: iron gall ink for the writing, and paints made from ground minerals that had been standard, inexpensive recipes for centuries: azurite for blue, a copper compound for green, red ochre for the reddish-brown tones. Nothing in the chemistry was out of place. No modern synthetic pigments, nothing that shouldn't exist before the 20th century. The kind of red flag that has exposed real forgeries in the past. The same category of mistake that caught out the so-called archaic Mark Codex, and the infamous Vinland map, where anachronistic titanium-based ink gave the fake away almost immediately. This manuscript passed that test cleanly. The materials are authentic. The age is authentic. Whatever this book is, it is not a modern hoax dressed up in old vellum. That should feel like an answer. Instead, it just made the real question sharper. If the object is real and the age is real, then the only thing left unexplained is the text itself, and the text refuses to behave like anything anyone has ever seen before. Here's where the actual science of the language gets strange, and you don't need a linguistics degree to feel why. Researchers studying word frequency in the manuscript, most notably a 2013 study published in the journal PLOS I, found that the words follow something called Zipf's law, a mathematical pattern that shows up naturally in every real human language, where a small number of words get used constantly and the rest trail off in a predictable curve. That's a strong argument for meaning. Real, structured language does this. Random gibberish typically doesn't. But then researchers looked deeper at the relationships between individual letters and found something no real language does. The predictability of what letter comes next, once you know the letter before it, is far higher in Voynichese than in any known human language, higher even than in most historical ciphers. Words often repeat 2 or 3 times in a row, almost never seen in genuine writing. It behaves like language at the level of the page. It behaves like something artificial at the level of the letter. One leading linguist studying the manuscript has described it as a genuine contradiction, information that looks completely different depending on whether you zoom in or zoom out. That contradiction has pulled at least one serious researcher toward a darker explanation. In the early 2000s, a British academic named Gordon Rugg proposed that the entire manuscript could be an elaborate hoax, not gibberish scribbled at random, but meaningless text generated methodically using a simple device called a card-in-grill, a perforated card slid over a table of syllables to mechanically assemble Voynich-like words. It's a tempting idea because it explains the contradiction cleanly. A mechanical process could easily produce text that behaves like language in some ways and nothing like language in others. For a while, it looked like the tidiest answer anyone had offered. Then 2 problems surfaced. First, the card-in-grill wasn't invented until around 1550, over a century after this manuscript's vellum was already sitting in someone's workshop, already covered in ink. Second, a 2013 study published in the journal PLOS I, analyzing how the manuscript's words cluster and repeat across different sections, found a pattern that looked less like randomness and more like actual content, Words behaving the way keywords behave in a real document, clustering around specific subject matter, the way genuine vocabulary would. The researchers behind that study were careful. They didn't claim they'd found meaning. They said the accumulated statistical evidence made the pure hoax explanation harder to defend. That doesn't prove the manuscript says anything at all, but it does mean the tidy answer, that this is all an elaborate medieval prank, doesn't fully survive contact with the numbers either. And that contradiction, the one no theory has cleanly resolved, is exactly why every single attempt to translate the text has ended in embarrassment. Take Stephen Bax, an applied linguist, who in 2014 proposed provisional readings for a handful of symbols by matching illustrated plants and stars to their names in medieval traditions. He framed it carefully, as a starting point, not a full solution, and even that cautious version never held up to scrutiny from other specialists, who found the matches statistically indistinguishable from coincidence. Then, in 2017, a television writer named Nicholas Gibbs published a claim in a respected literary publication that the entire manuscript was a women's health manual, and that every strange symbol was actually a shorthand abbreviation for Latin, referencing a supposed index that had simply been lost. It made global headlines within hours. It fell apart within days. Medieval manuscript specialists pointed out that running his method on the actual text didn't produce real Latin. It produced nonsense, the appearance of translation without the substance of it. The index he leaned on had no evidence it ever existed at all. Then in 2018 it happened again, this time wrapped in artificial intelligence. Computer scientists at the University of Alberta ran the manuscript's text through natural language processing software, trained on human rights documents in hundreds of languages, hoping an algorithm could identify the underlying tongue. It returned an answer, Hebrew, with the words scrambled as alphabetized anagrams. Headlines followed immediately. So did the skepticism. Other cryptographers pointed out the team had tested their own method on ciphers they'd written themselves. Identifying a possible source language isn't the same as decrypting a single sentence. The researchers, to their credit, admitted the results might just be statistical noise. 2 years later, in 2019, it happened again, louder. A research associate published a paper claiming to have identified the manuscript's language as an entirely unattested Proto-Romance tongue, cracked, in his own words, in about 2 weeks. His university put out an excited press release. Within a day, that same university quietly walked it back, distancing itself from the research entirely, stating concerns had been raised about its validity. One of the sharpest public critiques came from Lisa Fagan Davis, a manuscript specialist with the Medieval Academy of America, who didn't mince words, calling the claimed language category something that simply doesn't exist in linguistics, and pointing out that once you actually try to apply his substitution system to the text and translate it, you're left with nothing but gibberish dressed up as a discovery. Notice the pattern. Solve. Headline. Collapse. 4 times in under a decade. And every single collapse traces back to the same root problem. Someone tried to force meaning onto a text that has never once cooperated on anyone's terms, with anyone's method. That repeated failure isn't just embarrassing for the people involved. It's protective in a strange way for the institutions around them. Every retracted claim makes the next real discovery harder to hear, buried under the noise of the last false alarm, which is exactly why what Lisa Fagan Davis actually found, working quietly with imaging data instead of chasing a translation, deserves far more attention than it got. The scan itself happened years earlier, in 2014, when Yale's conservation team brought in specialized multispectral and ultraviolet imaging equipment ahead of loaning the manuscript out for the first time since arriving at the university. The goal wasn't decipherment, it was preservation science, checking the condition of the ink, the layering of the paint, whether anything had been retouched. The imaging confirmed the manuscript isn't a palimpsest. There's no erased older writing hiding underneath the visible text. But on folio 1 recto, in the margin, the scans captured something that had been sitting there the entire time, invisible to the naked eye, degraded almost to nothing. It took years for that specific detail to get the attention it deserved. In 2024, going back through the imaging archive, Fagan Davis confirmed what the faint marks actually were. First, the erased name, the same Jakob Hortzicke signature, already known from other records, scraped nearly off the page rather than simply faded by time. A physical, deliberate act, not decay. Second, and more striking, 3 separate rows written in the margin near it, one section using a normal Latin alphabet, one using symbols from the manuscript's own unknown script, and a third using a shifted version of the alphabet again. Put together, that looks like exactly one thing. Somebody, centuries ago, was building a decoding key, laying the manuscript's mystery letters next to normal letters, trying to match them up, trying to break the code the same way anyone would today. This wasn't a translation. Nobody has read a single sentence of the Voynich Manuscript because of this discovery, but it proves something the mystery book mythology conveniently skips over, that this wasn't a puzzle nobody ever got close to. Somebody sat with this book in the early 1600s, in the same city, obsessed with hidden knowledge and alchemical secrets, and tried, seriously, to crack it open using exactly the right method. And then that attempt was erased, not lost, not faded, scraped away, hard enough to leave a wound in the vellum that only modern imaging could pull back into visibility. That single detail rewrites the entire emotional shape of this story. The Voynich Manuscript isn't just an object nobody can read. It's an object where somebody's answer, or somebody's failed attempt at an answer, was deliberately destroyed, which forces an uncomfortable question that has no clean resolution. Who erases evidence like that? A frustrated researcher embarrassed his key hadn't worked, scrubbing his failure off the page. A later owner, protecting a reputation or protecting a secret they didn't want traced back to a specific name. Or someone even later, centuries after Hortzicke died, trying to keep the manuscript's mystery intact because an unsolved book sells for more and generates more attention than a solved one ever could? There's no document that answers that. There may never be one. But the erasure itself tells you something the whole legend conveniently leaves out, that at some point, being close to the answer was apparently something worth hiding. There's a case to be made that Hortzicke himself is the most obvious suspect. He was a chemist by trade, trained to test unidentified substances, ingredient by ingredient, the same instinct that would push someone to lay unfamiliar symbols next to a known alphabet and start testing for matches. If it was his own key, scraped off next to his own signature, it would mean the earliest documented owner of this book didn't just possess it. He worked on it directly, using the same systematic method a chemist would use on any other unidentified compound, and either gave up or got close enough to make someone nervous. This is where the story stops being just about a strange book and starts being about who benefits from strangeness staying unresolved. A solved Voynich manuscript is, in a real sense, a smaller Voynich manuscript, one more medieval curiosity, filed and footnoted, competing for attention against thousands of others. An unsolved one is a permanent global draw, one of the most viewed items in an entire university's digital collection, 6 centuries old and still generating headlines every time somebody claims a breakthrough. That doesn't mean Yale is hiding anything. There's no evidence of that. And the university has done the opposite, digitizing every page for free public access and funding the very imaging work that pulled this erased evidence back into view. The library's own curator pushed for more serious academic engagement with the book, publishing a full scholarly facsimile in 2016 specifically to invite historians and linguists who'd previously written the manuscript off as too embarrassing, too pop culture to study seriously. But it does mean the wider ecosystem around this manuscript, publishers chasing a viral headline, researchers chasing a career-defining claim, universities chasing press coverage, has repeatedly rewarded confident wrong answers, faster than it's rewarded slow, careful, real ones. Nicholas Gibbs got a global platform in a respected publication. Fagan Davis's actual physical discovery, arguably the most concrete new evidence about this manuscript in over a decade barely made the news at all. The scientific debate underneath all of this hasn't closed either, and it may never fully close. Some researchers, working from the same statistical data, argue the text's contradictions are best explained as a sophisticated but ultimately meaningless hoax, a system that could plausibly be generated mechanically, producing words that look real without meaning anything at all. Others studying the exact same numbers argue the opposite, that the deeper structural patterns, the way certain words cluster by section, the way real vocabulary would, are far too consistent to be an accident of a random word generator. Notably, even the researchers most sympathetic to the real language theory have gone back and tested the gibberish hypothesis seriously against their own conclusions, rather than dismissing it outright. That's not scientific failure. That's what an honest, unresolved mystery actually looks like, as opposed to the confident fake versions that keep collapsing in headlines. What's left, 600 years later, is a manuscript that has survived almost everything history could throw at it. It survived whatever original purpose it was built for, whatever conversation or secret or experiment prompted someone to invent an entire, unreadable script, rather than simply write in a language people already understood. It survived 2.5 centuries of silence inside Jesuit collections, forgotten or deliberately unmentioned. It survived a Siberian exile-turned-book dealer who staked his legacy on a theory that science would eventually kill. It survived at least 4 separate public claims to have finally cracked it, each one dissolving faster than the last. And it survived, physically, an act of erasure specifically designed to make sure nobody would ever know just how close somebody once got. The manuscript sits in New Haven today, under climate-controlled glass, its pages digitized and freely available to anyone on Earth with an internet connection, and still, functionally, as unread as the day Wilfrid Voynich carried it out of that villa near Rome. Researchers keep circling it. Statisticians keep running the numbers. Every few years, someone else steps forward, certain they've finally found the key, and every few years, that certainty quietly falls apart under closer inspection. Conservators in white gloves still turn its pages under raking light, hunting for the next erased detail a scanner might have missed. Cryptographers still feed its text into newer software, hoping the next algorithm succeeds where the last one embarrassed itself. The real discovery, the one that actually held up, wasn't a translation at all. It was proof that someone, 400 years ago, tried the same thing everyone since has tried, and instead of leaving behind an answer, they left behind a scar on the page where their attempt used to be. Somewhere in the middle of that same book, the 6-panel foldout of 9 linked circles is still waiting too, still refusing to resolve into a map or a chart or anything researchers can agree on. Somewhere in that scar is the only honest ending this story has. Not a solved cipher, not a hidden confession finally read aloud after 6 centuries of silence. Just a name, scraped almost to nothing, sitting beside 3 rows of letters that were trying, one final time, to make sense of something that still refuses to make sense to anyone else. The lamp clicks off. The glow fades from the vellum. And Folio 1 Recto goes back to looking, to the naked eye, like nothing more than an old page with a name too faint to read. While the book beside it keeps waiting, exactly as it has for 600 years for someone to finish what that erased name started